The ship vibrated as it slipped into hyperspace, the hum of the engine steady and reassuring. Elias leaned back in the pilot's chair, his hands resting on the controls, as the swirling tunnel of light stretched out before them. Beside him, Mira sat quietly in the co-pilot's seat, her posture calm but her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Tala was curled up in the small passenger seat behind them, her glowing orb dim as she dozed off. The quiet was a stark contrast to the chaos they'd left behind at the station. Their departure hadn't been without incident. Station guards had flagged their ship for unpaid docking fees, and Elias had to bribe a mechanic to clear them for takeoff. But now, with the stars rushing past them, they finally had a moment to breathe. Elias glanced at Mira. "So, how long until we hit this sanctuary planet of yours?" "Approximately 4 standard days," Mira replied, "if we maintain this speed and avoid detection." "Vigith," Elias muttered, scanning the sensors for any signs of trouble. The route to Ellerin Prime was infamous for its pirate activity, and he wasn't about to let his guard down. Not when there was so much at stake. As if reading his thoughts, Mira spoke softly. "You worry for her." Elias turned to her, surprised. "Tala, of course I do. She's just a kid. She doesn't deserve to be caught up in all this." Mira's golden eyes softened, and she nodded. "You have a kind heart, Elias. More than you let on." He snorted, turning back to the controls. "Don't start with that. I'm just doing what anyone decent would do." "No," Mira said, her voice firm but warm. "Most would have walked away. You chose to stay. That makes you different." Elias didn't respond, but her words lingered in his mind. He'd spent so many years avoiding attachments, running from the pain of his past, that he hadn't realized how much he'd missed having a purpose beyond himself. And now, sitting here with this little makeshift family, he felt something he hadn't felt in years: belonging. Hours later, the ship's proximity alarm blared, jolting Elias awake. He bolted upright in his chair, his heart racing as red lights flashed across the console. Mira was already at the co-pilot's seat, her sharp eyes scanning the redouts. "Pirates," she said calmly, though her voice carried a note of tension. Elias cursed under his breath. 3 ships had appeared on their sensors, their trajectories closing in fast. He gripped the controls, adrenaline surging. "Hang on. This might get bumpy." As the pirate ships opened fire, Elias threw the ship into a sharp dive, dodging the incoming blasts. Mira worked quickly at her station, rerouting power to the shields and stabilizing the engines. Tala woke up, clutching her orb tightly, her eyes wide with fear. "It's okay, kid," Elias said, his voice steady despite the chaos. "I've got this." Mira glanced at him, her trust evident in her expression. Together, they navigated the storm of fire and chaos, Elias's quick thinking and Mira's precision, keeping the ship one step ahead of their attackers. After a tense chase, Elias managed to outmaneuver the pirates, diving into a nearby asteroid field and losing them in the debris. The ship emerged from the field, battered but intact. Elias let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, slumping back in his chair. "Well, that was fun," he said, his voice laced with exhaustion. Mira turned to him, a rare smile gracing her lips. "You handled that well, Captain." He chuckled, rubbing the back of his neck. "Yeah, well, I had a good co-pilot." Tala crawled into his lap, her tiny arms wrapping around his neck. "Ethan's safe," she murmured, her voice sleepy but full of trust. Elias froze for a moment, then hugged her gently, his chest tightening. "Yeah, kid," he said softly. "We're safe." As they continued their journey to Ellerin Prime, Elias realized something important. He wasn't just a pilot anymore. He was part of something bigger, a family. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough. Elias stared at Mira, completely stunned. Out of all the bizarre encounters he'd had in his years as a freighter captain, this one was by far the strangest. Asking a stranger, no, a human, to be a stepfather to an alien child. It didn't make sense. He cleared his throat, trying to gather his thoughts. Look, Mira, was it? I think you've got the wrong guy. I'm just a pilot, not exactly father material. Mira's golden eyes didn't waver. She stepped closer, her voice calm but urgent. You are the right man. I have done my research. Your reputation precedes you, Captain Stone. You have worked with many species, traveled to dangerous places, and survived challenges that most would not. Elias frowned, glancing at the little girl. She peeked at him with wide, curious eyes before quickly hiding her face in her mother's neck again. Something about her small, vulnerable form made his chest tighten. Even if all that's true, he said, shaking his head, why me? Why not someone else? Surely there's someone better suited for this. Mira's shoulders stiffened, and for a moment she looked away, as if wrestling with a painful memory. My mate, Relin, was killed in an attack on our transport vessel 2 weeks ago. He was all we had. His family has disowned me for refusing to return to our homeworld. They do not approve of the life we chose. Elias let out a low breath, her words sinking in. He'd heard stories like hers before, families torn apart by tradition or politics. But this was different. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for her daughter. I've been on this station for days, Mira continued, her voice trembling slightly. I have asked others for help, but no one would take us in. No one cares. Except, I was told you are not like the others. That humans value loyalty, even to strangers. Elias leaned forward, rubbing the back of his neck. Loyalty's great, but this is a lot to ask of someone you've never met. Mira's gaze hardened, and she took another step closer. This is not just for me. It is for her. She gestured to the child in her arms, who glanced up again, her large blue eyes shimmering with innocence. If something happens to me, she will have no one. She is innocent in all this. She deserves a chance. Elias felt a lump forming in his throat. He'd faced pirates, dangerous missions, and countless brushes with death. But this was different. This was personal. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. All right, let's say I agree to this crazy idea. What exactly are you expecting from me? Mira's expression softened, relief flickering across her face. Protection, guidance, a chance for her to grow in safety. You would not be alone. I would still be here to care for her, but she needs stability. Someone who can teach her courage and kindness. Elias groaned, shaking his head. This is insane. But as he looked at the child, her tiny fingers gripping her mother's shoulder, he felt something stir inside him. Something he thought he'd lost a long time ago. Fine, he muttered, surprising even himself. I'll think about it, but no promises. Mira's face brightened, and for the first time, Elias saw the faintest smile. That is all I ask. Captain Elias Stone sat in the corner of the bustling docking bay on Novara Station, sipping from a steaming mug of bitter synth coffee. His ship, the Starlight Arrow, sat in the hangar behind him, a mess of exposed wires and burnt-out conduits. Repairs would take at least 2 days, and his dwindling credits meant he'd have to find some side work to pay for it. Elias hated waiting. The station was overcrowded, noisy, and full of people too busy with their own problems to spare a glance at a stranded human freighter pilot. He had no interest in mingling with the various alien species passing by, nor did he expect much in the way of company. He was a loner, a man more at home among the stars than on a crowded station. But then she appeared. Out of the corner of his eye, Elias saw her, tall, graceful, with blue skin that shimmered faintly in the artificial light. Her long white hair flowed over her shoulders, and her sharp, angular features gave her an air of nobility. She carried a small child on her hip, a little girl with matching blue skin and dark, curly hair. The child clung to her mother tightly, wide eyes taking in the busy docking bay. Elias wasn't the type to stare, but something about her caught his attention. Maybe it was the way she moved, her steps purposeful yet weary, or the way her eyes scanned the room, searching for something or someone. She seemed out of place, a fragile elegance amidst the grease-streaked workers and rough-edged mercenaries. She stopped near him, hesitating. For a moment, she simply stood there, as if gathering her courage. Then, to his surprise, she turned and approached him directly. "Are you Captain Elias Stone?" she asked, her voice soft yet firm. Elias raised an eyebrow, surprised she knew his name. "Depends who's asking." She shifted the child on her hip, her expression calm but her eyes betraying a flicker of nervousness. "My name is Mira Valine. I need your help." Elias leaned back in his chair, taking a slow sip of his coffee. "Lady, I'm just a freighter pilot. Not much I can do for you, unless you need cargo hauled." "It is not cargo," Mira said, her tone steady. "It is personal." Elias studied her more closely. She looked tired, like someone carrying the weight of the universe on her shoulders. The little girl clung to her mother, hiding her face in Mira's neck. Something about the sight stirred a pang of sympathy in him, something he wasn't used to feeling. "What kind of personal help are we talking about?" Elias asked cautiously. Mira hesitated, her grip tightening on the child. "I have no one else to turn to. My mate, he is gone. And my daughter." Her voice wavered for a moment, but she steadied herself. "She needs protection, a guardian, someone to care for her." Elias blinked, caught off guard. "Wait, you're asking me to?" "Yes," Mira interrupted, her golden eyes locking onto his. "I am asking you to take responsibility for her, to be her father." For the first time in years, Elias was completely speechless. Elias sat on an overturned crate, tools scattered around him, staring at the damaged ship in front of him. He'd agreed to help Mira and her daughter, but now the reality of the situation was sinking in. This ship wasn't just broken, it was barely holding itself together. The hull was riddled with cracks, the thrusters were fried, and the navigation system looked like it hadn't worked in years. Mira stood nearby, holding her daughter on her hip. She watched Elias with quiet determination, her white hair glowing faintly under the docking bay's lights. The little girl, Tala, as Mira had introduced her, peeked shyly at him, clutching her toy as if it were a shield. "Captain Stone," Mira said, stepping closer. "Is it repairable?" Elias sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's possible, but it's going to take a lot of work, and I'll need parts that aren't exactly easy to find on this station." Mira nodded, her expression calm. "I trust you will find a way." Elias raised an eyebrow at her. "You've got a lot of faith in someone you barely know." "You agreed to help," she replied simply. "That tells me more about your character than you realize." He snorted, shaking his head. "I hope you're not expecting miracles." Before Mira could respond, Tala tugged on her sleeve and whispered something in her native language. Mira smiled softly and set the girl down. To Elias's surprise, Tala walked over to him, holding out her stuffed toy, a small blue creature with floppy ears. "What's this?" Elias asked, blinking at her. "She wants you to have it," Mira said, her voice warm. "It is her way of saying thank you." Elias hesitated, unsure of how to respond. He wasn't used to kindness, especially not from kids. Slowly, he reached out and took the toy. Thanks, kid." Tala giggled and quickly scampered back to her mother's side. Elias stared at the toy in his hand, a strange warmth spreading through him. Maybe this wouldn't be so bad after all. Hours later, Elias was elbow-deep in the ship's engine bay, cursing under his breath as he tried to coax life back into the thrusters. Mira watched from a distance, occasionally handing him tools or holding a light. They worked in silence for the most part, though Elias could feel her eyes on him. "You are good at this," Mira said finally, breaking the quiet. Elias shrugged, wiping grease off his hands. "It's just mechanics. Fixing things is easier than, dealing with people." Mira tilted her head, her golden eyes thoughtful. And yet, you are helping us. Yeah, well, Elias muttered, trying to downplay it. I guess I've got a soft spot for lost causes. Mira smiled faintly, but there was sadness in her gaze. We are not a lost cause, Captain. We are a family in need of hope. Elias paused, her words hitting him harder than he expected. Family. It had been a long time since he'd had anything close to that. Maybe it was time he stopped running from the idea. He glanced at Mira and Tala, who had fallen asleep in her mother's arms, and felt something shift inside him. For the first time in years, he wondered if he could be part of something more than just a lone pilot drifting through the galaxy. Well, he said quietly, turning back to the engine. Let's get this ship flying. We've got a lot of work to do. When Elias arrived at Docking Bay 12, he found Mira standing near a sleek, compact vessel that had clearly seen better days. The little girl was sitting quietly on a crate, holding a stuffed toy that looked like some kind of alien animal. Mira turned as he approached, her expression calm but resolute. "This is my ship," she said, gesturing to the vessel, "or what remains of it. We were attacked by raiders during our last journey. Raylan died protecting us, and the ship barely made it to this station. It is in no condition to fly." Elias frowned, stepping closer to inspect the craft. The hull was scorched, and several panels were missing entirely. "This thing won't even make it out of the station without falling apart." "Exactly," Mira replied. "That is why we cannot leave, and why I cannot protect her alone." Elias glanced at the little girl. She looked up at him with those same wide eyes, clutching the toy tightly. A pang of something he couldn't quite name hit him square in the chest. "Look, Mira," he said, keeping his tone even. "I get that you're in a tough spot, but dragging me into this isn't going to magically fix everything." Mira stepped closer, her gaze steady. "Elias, you are not being dragged. You are being chosen. I see something in you, something strong, something kind. Whether you realize it or not, you have what she needs." Elias opened his mouth to argue but stopped. For a moment, he didn't see a desperate widow or a broken ship. He saw a mother who would do anything to protect her child, even trust a complete stranger. Before he could overthink it, the words spilled out. "All right, I'll help. But let's get one thing straight. I'm no hero, and I don't know the first thing about kids." Mira's lips curved into a small smile. "You will learn. And for what it's worth, thank you." The little girl giggled softly, clutching her toy, as if the world had suddenly become a little less scary. For the first time, Elias felt something other than doubt. He felt a flicker of purpose. The ship's engines roared to life, filling the docking bay with a low hum that sent vibrations through the metal floor. Elias grinned despite himself, leaning back against the control console. "There we go," he said, brushing grease off his hands. "She's alive. Barely, but alive." Mira stood nearby, her hands clasped in front of her. Her usual composed demeanor cracked slightly as she let out a breath of relief. "Thank you, Elias. I cannot express how much this means to us." Tala, sitting on a crate with her glowing orb, clapped her hands excitedly. "Fly now?" she asked, her voice bright and hopeful. Elias chuckled, shaking his head. "Not yet, kiddo. We still need clearance to leave this station without raising suspicion. You don't want a bunch of station guards chasing us, do you?" Tala giggled and shook her head, hugging the orb to her chest. Elias's smile faded as he turned back to the console, double-checking the systems. "Speaking of leaving, where exactly are we going, Mira? You never mentioned a destination." Mira hesitated, her expression darkening. "There is a sanctuary planet on the edge of neutral space, a place where refugees can live safely, away from conflict. It is called Ellerin Prime." Elias raised an eyebrow. "Ellerin Prime. That's a long haul, and it's not exactly easy to get to. The route is crawling with pirate patrols." Mira nodded solemnly. "I know. That is why I need you. I cannot protect Tala on my own if we encounter trouble." Elias leaned against the console, crossing his arms. "You're putting a lot of trust in me, Mira. What if I just took off and left you two behind?" Mira's golden eyes met his, unwavering. "You won't." Her certainty caught him off guard. For a moment, he didn't know how to respond. Finally, he sighed, running a hand through his hair. "You're right. I won't. But I hope you realize what you're asking me to do. This isn't just a delivery job. It's dangerous." Mira stepped closer, her voice quiet but firm. "I understand the risks, Elias, but this is not just about me. It is about Tala. She deserves a future, a chance to grow up in peace. I will do whatever it takes to give her that." Elias glanced at Tala, who was busy playing with her orb, her small giggles echoing through the bay. He couldn't deny the pang of protectiveness he felt every time he looked at her. She didn't deserve to grow up in fear, constantly running from danger. "Fine," he said finally, his voice gruff. "I'll get you to Ellerin Prime, but don't expect this to be a smooth ride. Pirates don't exactly roll out the welcome mat." Mira's lips curved into a small smile. "I do not expect ease, Captain. Only that you keep your promise." Elias nodded, adjusting the strap of his toolkit. "All right then. Let's get this ship fueled up and ready. The sooner we leave, the better." As he turned back to the controls, he felt Mira's hand on his arm. Surprised, he glanced at her, and she spoke softly. "You are giving us more than just a ride, Elias. You are giving us hope." For once, Elias didn't have a snarky reply. He simply nodded, turning back to his work. Maybe, just maybe, this mission wasn't just about fixing a broken ship or escaping a dangerous route. Maybe it was about fixing something in himself, too. Elias tightened the last bolt on the ship's engine, letting out a tired sigh. The thrusters were finally operational, at least enough to get the ship into basic flight. He wiped the sweat and grease from his forehead with the back of his hand and stepped down from the platform he'd been working on for hours. Behind him, Mira approached, carrying a tray of food she had managed to scrounge from the station's vendors. Tala trailed behind her, holding a small glowing orb that hummed softly as she played with it. "How is it?" Mira asked, setting the tray on a crate. Elias glanced back at the engine, shaking his head. "It'll fly, but it won't win any beauty contests. The thrusters are stable, but if you try anything fancy, it'll fall apart faster than a deck of cards in a windstorm." Mira tilted her head, studying him with those calm, golden eyes of hers. "You underestimate yourself, Captain. This ship was unfit for even the simplest flight 2 days ago. Now, thanks to you, it has a chance." Elias shrugged, sitting down on a crate and grabbing one of the protein bars Mira had brought. "Yeah, well, I hope you're not planning on taking it into a firefight." Mira smiled faintly, a rare softness in her usually composed expression. "No firefights, just survival." Tala climbed up beside Elias, her small hands clutching the glowing orb as she stared at him. "Ethan," she said, her voice hesitant. Elias raised an eyebrow, realizing she was trying to say his name. "It's Elias," he corrected, though his tone was gentle. "But close enough, kid." Tala giggled and held up the orb to him. "Fix." He frowned, taking the orb from her and turning it over in his hands. It was some kind of Xylarian toy, but the power crystal inside had dimmed, making it flicker. With a smirk, he reached into his toolkit and pulled out a small multi-tool, popping open the casing and adjusting the crystal's connection. "There," he said, handing it back to her. The orb glowed brightly, and Tala squealed with delight, hugging it close. Mira watched the interaction quietly, her expression thoughtful. "You are good with her," she said after a moment. Elias scoffed, leaning back against the crate. "She's a kid. Fixing toys is easy. It's the rest of it I'm not so sure about." Mira stepped closer, her voice quiet. "You do not need to be perfect, Elias. You only need to care. That is what she needs most." He looked up at her, her words sinking in. For a moment, he didn't know what to say. He'd spent so long drifting through life, avoiding connections, that the idea of someone needing him, really needing him, was foreign. But looking at Tala, clutching her toy with a bright smile, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Purpose. "All right," he said finally, standing. "Let's finish getting this ship ready. If we're doing this, we're doing it right." Mira's smile widened, a rare glimpse of hope shining through her calm demeanor. "Thank you, Captain." Elias nodded, glancing at Tala. "Yeah. Let's just hope she doesn't regret it." As they worked side by side, the once isolated freighter captain began to realize he might be building more than just a ship. He might be building a family.